Hello everyone. My name is Vidisha, and I am a fifth-year student at the Bachelor's of Urban Design course at Sutton University. And I welcome you all to our third session of the Informal Talks webinar series. I hope everyone's safe, everyone's healthy, I hope everyone's doing fine. To all those who are joining in for the first time, let me introduce you all to the Informal Talks first. We started, this is a student-led initiative which was started about 2 years ago. And the idea was that, we used to sit in our studios and used to invite people who used to work in the urban realm and have a conversation about their work and about their inspiration. So as you all know that now we are moving to a new mode of online learning, and we're really happy and excited to extend the Informal Talks lecture series to now webinar series. So before we move on towards the introduction of our speaker today, I would just request all of you to write down your questions to the chat box that we have available to the right-hand side top corner. And we will take up the question and answer session after the presentation is over. So I would now request Srishti to give an introduction to our today's speaker. Over to you, Srishti.
Hello, everyone. Prashant sir, you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah.
Oh, great. So today we have Dr. Prashant Heda on board, and we are really, really honored to have him with us on Informal Talks. Actually, it's a very difficult task to introduce him in just few minutes, as he has worked extensively in field of regional planning, landscape, and architecture. But to start with, after finishing his bachelor's in architecture from JJ School of Architecture, Bombay, he specialized in landscape architecture from University of Pennsylvania. He has also received a doctorate from University of California, UC Davis. So when we were having a chat with him, we asked him how he has changed his perspective towards looking towards design and what led him thinking to changing of the design. So that's when he told about a book that he came across. The name of the book is Design with Nature, written by Ian McHardt. He's going to talk about him in the talk later. So this book redefined the profession of landscape architecture and brought brought landscape architecture closer to planning and urban design. So initially, when he was working manually on the geographical parameters, with the boom of technology, he slowly shifted to GIS mapping. And Sir has worked as an GIS analyst and consultant since 1990s with most renowned institutions, to name few: Berkeley GIS Lab in US, or World Wildlife Fund US and West Africa, ESRI, which is Environment System Research Institute in USA, which is the largest GIS software company in world, and also with Auroville Town Development Council. So along with this, he has a very unconventional manner of looking towards design, and that's why he has worked with disaster relief projects like Auroville Tsunami Relief and Rehab Project, or Shelter Advisory Group in Tamil Nadu, or on Bihar Tsunami and Orissa Coastal Infrastructure Vulnerability Project. So Sir is currently working with World Health Organization as a GIS consultant and regional planner in Auroville. So having this superb expertise, most of what Sir enjoys is spending time with students and having conversation with them. He is very enthusiastic and excited to talk with students always. And I feel we should all make this informal talk really productive by asking him most possible questions that we can. So over to you, sir. You can begin with the presentation now.
Okay. Thank you, Srishti and Vidisha, for the kind introduction. Sounds very big, but anyhow, it's if you work for a few years, long time, you end up with, and if you keep changing your interests, you keep moving from one place to other place, you would do that. So it does happen. So anyway, yeah. So as Srishti mentioned that I've been an architect and landscape architect, but not really designed a building or have worked in landscape field in the conventional sense. And so I'm going to present today the work that I've done over the last 3 decades in different areas and different places. And I'm going to, I don't know if I should turn the video on, but can you hear me? Can everybody hear me well? You can all hear me?
Yes, sir. We can. Yes, sir. We can hear you perfectly fine.
Okay. So let's start with this. So I'm going to start my presentation, and this is the title. Actually, it's a very interesting title, and I think we all came together with the title because it's difficult to put the work that I do in a particular box. And I think we all today understand that the environment is going through a lot of challenges, and it's a very challenging times in terms of everything that's going on around in the world. We also understand that we need to protect the environment and ecosystem and give space to other species that also we share the planet with. And to be able to save and do anything about it, you have to first understand. And you can't appreciate something, or you can't protect something unless you understand the systems that are there that are actually driving these larger systems, which are part of the larger systems of the planet. And this is where I've tried to, in my work, I've tried to understand the systems. And so I'll start with, as Srishti mentioned, that I studied under a professor who's known as almost like the father of the ecological planning in the US, and he redefined the profession of landscape architecture in the way that it used to be conventional garden design, kind of classical garden design landscape, like of the Frederick Law Olmsted, or who designed the Central Park in New York, and also the Boston chain of parks. And so he was, that's how landscape was. And it was a very isolated field in the sense that it would come at the end when after the architect has designed the buildings, and you have a lot of leftover space. So you have to put in circulation, parking, green areas, plantations, seating, parking, street furniture, all kinds of things, that elements of landscape architecture. What he did, Ian McHugh did, was he actually looked at the landscape in the larger sense of the landscape, which is the look at larger sense in terms of deserts, in terms of ecosystems, in terms of rainforests, in terms of slopes, looking at geology, looking at biodiversity corridors, vegetation, forest types, climate, and all these jointly actually systems together make up a landscape. And he looked at landscape from that view, and since then the profession has changed a lot. And he wrote this classic book in 1969, which was way ahead of its time when he was talking about the environment. He was one of the founders of the Earth Day in 1970 in Philadelphia, I studied under him towards the end of his career in 1989. And so he always talked about that shaping of the land for human use ought to be based on the understanding of the natural processes that make up the landscape. And he emphasized that through practice, through teaching, and also through large network of communications he did with people, like made a show, had interviews with Nobel laureates, and he had this program called Man and Environment in the landscape architecture program. And the landscape architecture program there actually had a lot of scientists, not just designers. And here is what he said in one of his interviews in 1995. He said that he was trying to find physical scientists who were not just looking at their own field, but trying to relate with other fields. And you need to have a biologist who also looks at the hydrology, also looks at geology, also looks at the soils, and also willing to work with each other. And also then eventually not just with physical sciences or physical geography, but also with human geography, which is social sciences, how humans impact landscape. And then he mentioned that initially when he in a group, when he would talk about design, they would just run away screaming. That's what literally his words were. So it took him a long time to set up this whole program, and now he has a legacy of the program that is landscape architecture programs that are based on his model are taught all around the world. And he started the program in 1955 and was a chairman of the program until 1985. So 30 years it took him to redefine this profession. And in the meantime, this whole geographic information system as a field evolved, and that actually gave him a lot of hope that it would be, people would be able to do much more detailed analysis with these computerized mapping and digital technologies. And so he was one of the first persons to hire a GIS mapping person in his University of Pennsylvania in 1985 at the program. So eventually what he did talk about, that you have to look at the larger picture even when you're designing a smaller scale at any finer scale. So I'll just take you through some of the larger global perspectives so that we don't lose the perspective of where we live and how we are. So this is a map that shows the population, and you can see that it's not evenly distributed. 1/3 of the planet is land, and that there also you can see the large areas where almost nobody lives, like obviously like the Sahara Desert or the rainforests of Amazon or the northern boreal forests, or large swaths of desert in Australia. And there are areas where there is a lot of population lives there, and you can see what jumps out is the eastern US and then West Africa and India and China. These are the areas. In China, you'll see that it's one of the very populated countries, but it's still on the eastern side, and because the western part of China is a large, very high elevation desert, the Tibetan Gobi Desert, and that's how we actually humans decide where to live based on where you can live, and that also where other species share the space is also important. And here is a map of if you look at this map, population map, and then you look at this map, it shows it matches quite well. But this is a map of night lights taken at 4 a.m. and it's not a single map. It's actually a map series of images stitched together, because there's never night at the same time everywhere in the world. It's daytime here in the US, it's early morning, and so this is actually the images of 4 a.m. stitched together, and they and this scientists made up this map. But this also shows that the population distribution is, they use the night lights as access to resources and human impact on the landscapes. And I'll tell you how it relates to the impact on the landscapes. But you'll see that West Africa, where there was a lot of population but doesn't show that much light, and that actually tells us a lot about equitable distribution of resources. Some people have access to a lot of resources, and there are people who don't have access to a lot of resources, and that's very clearly visible from this map. I was surprised when in 1998, I remember one of the telecom entrepreneurs told me that the number of telephones in whole of continent of Africa, which has 54 countries, is less than the number of telephones in the city of Tokyo. So just one city in a developed country like Tokyo has more telephones than the whole continent of Africa. So that's the kind of unequitable world we live in, where resources are not equally shared. Some people have more, some people have less, and that also affects how we live and how we interact with the landscapes. So here's a map of global major habitat types, and this shows where the rainforests are, where the deserts are, where the grasslands are, where high elevation deserts are, where the low elevation deserts are, where are the wetlands and grasslands. And this is this distinguishes between different continents, because the rainforest, that goes by distribution of species, because the rainforest in Amazon has, that you see over here, let me just see if I can point to that. I'm sure everybody knows where the rainforest of Amazon is, but I wanted to point out a few things. Okay, so this is the rainforest of Amazon along the Amazonia River, and this is the rainforest of West Africa, and this is the rainforest of Western Ghats, and the rainforest in Indonesia, Malaysia. So they are mostly in the tropical belt, and that actually holds 50% of the world's species are actually in these tropical belt. But you also have to understand that species that exist in Amazonia are very different from the species that exist in West Africa and then Western Ghats and then Indonesia, Malaysia, and Papua New Guinea. So that also makes these unique ecosystems even more unique, because their rainforests are different. Similarly, a desert from Thar Desert of India to Sahara Desert and South African deserts are very, very different from each other. And this is how this is how we try to understand what happens in these landscapes and how we live there and how people are interacting with the landscapes. So here is a map that shows the human impact on the landscapes, and the red dark color is largely impacted by humans, whereas the green color is less impacted, and it's at a scale of 0 to 64. There were 4 major factors that went into determining these impacts. One is access roads, navigation rivers, how people move around, and also population densities, land use, land cover change, and also that night light lamp that I showed, satellite image that I showed you is how also tells us about how much humans have impacted the landscapes. So these 4 factors together, there was a study done by Wildlife Conservation Society and Smithsonian and Columbia University, and they did a very extensive impact of the landscapes on how we have seen very strongly. You can see the Indo-Gangetic plains stands out in the upper regions of India, just on the foothills of the Himalayas. Then Europe, of course, is very, very highly impacted. Then Eastern US, the Western US is not much impacted because of its largely desert landscape. And then the Central America, and then the eastern coast of Brazil, and then of course China, Japan are very, very highly populated. And you know that Indonesia is the 3rd largest populated country in the world, but largely 80% of the population lives on the island of Java. That's why you see a large more Java island, you see large more areas of green, and which is less human impact on the landscape. But humans have the capacity to impact the landscape in a big way. I'll just show you some couple of examples that how humans have impacted landscapes. So here's a expanding city of Las Vegas. Everybody knows Las Vegas, the gambling capital of the world, in the West Coast, in the western part of the US. It's in the middle of a desert, and it is also it was a small settlement started there for building the Hoover Dam, and then eventually it became expanded as gambling was allowed as the only economic activity. There's nothing else to do over there. So how did this town expand? This is how 1973 it looked like, but by the time it was 2000, this is what it looked like. And then you'll see this animation over here, which shows how a small small city has evolved over bigger, and how big it got in 1995. That's what it looked like. And the image on the left is showing the 2000. And can you imagine, this is in the middle of a desert, and look at the green spaces over there, and that's how much water you consume. And that Hoover Dam, one of the largest dams when it was built on the Colorado River, was actually the water source for this town. And I remember reading an article in LA Times in late 90s when I used to live in California. There was an article where the article stated that a lady got very upset at a policeman in Las Vegas because she was watering her lawn in the city of Las Vegas at the middle of the day, in the middle of the day when the temperatures are in the higher 40s and 50s, close to 50 degrees Celsius. And the police was telling her that she should water her lawn early in the morning or evening so that she can conserve water. And she got really upset at the policeman and told the policeman that, you know, if you continue putting restrictions like this, one day you will convert this place into a desert, without realizing that she was actually living in a desert. And this is how we get disconnected with the landscapes where we live in. And that's a classic example of how we change landscapes so much that we don't even know what existed there before at some point. And here is another example of a large freshwater lake, which is one of the 4th largest lake in 1960s, called the Aral Sea. And it's on the border of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan in Central Asia. And that's what the lake looked like in 1973. It had 2 streams that fed the lake. One was Amur Darya and other was Sir Darya on the backside of the Hindu Kush Mountains, north of Afghanistan and in the Central Asia. And they found out in the 60s that the soil was very good for growing cotton. And so they had a massive crop of cotton growing started over there. And for that, they had to dam the rivers, and then they started growing. They had a bumper crop of cotton over there, and it was a big flourishing countryside. And slowly the lake started disappearing as the water that was reaching the lake was less and less and less. This is what it looked like in 86. This is what the lake looked like in 1999, and this is what it looked like in 2004. And pretty much this is what state of the lake is right now. And that boat that you see over there, and if you look at the first image, You see where the coastline was, and now you see where the coastline is. And this boat that you see over here that is stuck in the sand was actually a fishing village, which is now about 70 kilometers away from the coastline, which was somewhere here, and now it is coastline is somewhere here. And over the years, as the fertility of the soil went down, they added more, you started using more pesticides and fertilizers, and eventually it became a very, very unlivable landscape where had cancer cases because of excessive use of fertilizers. And this is an example I'm just showing you because we can alter a landscape in such a way that actually there's no going back. In this case, you cannot actually restore this landscape no matter how hard you try. This is a completely altered landscape. And you see the color of the water has changed because of the chemicals and other things that have gone in, and there are cancer cases in this area, and it's no longer livable area. It was known as the curse of white gold because there was a story published by Center for Science and Environment, which said that the white cotton was known as white gold at that time, and that's how it was. People made money, and now it's a doomed landscape. So what do we know about the world in terms of biodiversity and hotspots and other species? So as I mentioned earlier, there was a major habitat type map I showed. There are areas where there are biodiversity hotspots, and people realized at some point that we are not going to save everything on the world. Let's focus on certain areas which rich on species and try to save them. So the British biologist Norman Myers came up with this concept of biodiversity hotspots in early 90s and late 80s. 1980s and 1990s, and with Conservation International, international NGO, he came up with this idea of global biodiversity hotspot where we need to protect. And India had Western Ghats and the northern Himalayan landscapes in that, and then there are Brazilian landscapes, and there's a Mediterranean grassland along the Mediterranean Sea, and there's the rainforests of Southeast Asia. So very interesting map, and then. But it also focused largely on wherever there were a number of species or more. So in 1998, World Wildlife Fund, and I was part of the study, which came up with 200 ecoregions that need to be saved. And they actually divided, not just looked at the terrestrial land-based ecosystems, but also freshwater and marine ecosystems. So you see these dark patches over there. These are important marine areas that need to be protected. And there are freshwater ecosystems in that. And I'll show you more about this. So what they were saying is that World Wildlife Fund, what we mentioned, said that the rainforests are important to save because we save 50% of the species, but what about the rest of the 50% of the species? So we need to save some deserts, some grasslands, some Mediterranean grasslands, and other areas also like the Chihuahua Desert of Mexico and the Australian desert, and this coastal desert of South Africa are really, really important places because what species you find over there, you don't find anywhere else in the world. So we came up with these 200 ecoregions that need to be saved. And India had Western Ghats and this freshwater also, because this is a freshwater landscape which needs to be conserved because it receives a lot of rainfall, and that actually sustains the agriculture of people who are living in this area in the southern India peninsula. And then the Eastern Ghats also was added to it, and then the Terai landscapes of the foothills of the Himalayas and Nepal. And this is how you slowly get into landscapes that we need to preserve and where we should build and where we should not build. And here's a map of the watershed, which shows the different watersheds of the rivers. And as I showed you earlier, this is the most dense area in the world, the Gangetic Plains. And then there's a Western Ghats, and there is Kaveri Delta, and then there are all the other different Mahanadi and other rivers. And there are about 58 rivers that originate from Western Ghats, and I'll come to that in a minute. And this picture is the picture of Tal Kaveri, where the Kaveri River originates in Coorg. And that actually flows through two states and eventually goes into the Bay of Bengal in your southern part of Tamil Nadu. And that actually supports agriculture for millions of people who live along that river. And then, so this is what I was showing you about the Western Ghats. This is that strip that you see around, starting from southern tip of Gujarat, goes through Maharashtra, Goa, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and Karnataka. And this is a cut across 6 states, and an average is about 100 kilometers wide and 1,600 kilometers long. And this is a global biodiversity hotspot. This map is taken from Madhav Gadgil study. If you are aware that Madhav Gadgil, one of the famous ecologists, one of the most famous ecologists in India, he came up with this Western Ghats expert ecology panel in 2011. He submitted a report to the Ministry of Environment and Forests what they should be doing to preserve this Western Ghats. It's not just the Western Ghats that you need to preserve because of the species that it supports, but also the rivers that originate from here and that support the lands, the agriculture of and millions of people who live in this whole area. This is Western Ghats is the place which receives the first rains in the monsoons. It's a steep sloping hills facing the western coast, and that gets most of the rainfall, which includes Kerala and goes all the way through Bombay. And just when you go across on the eastern side of the Western Ghats, suddenly the rainfall drops, and this heavy rainfall creates the amazing rainforest that it is, and that actually supports the rest of the country with the groundwater and the rivers. And this is a map of the Kaveri Delta that actually somewhere here, river, that red color that you see is the Coorg district, also known as Kodagu, which was the original name of that, and British anglicized the name to Coorg. And it originates over here and then cuts across 2 states and then eventually goes into the Bay of Bengal, which has a very, very wide delta over here, just like the Sundarbans Delta of Ganga and other delta rivers of Mahanadi and Krishna, Godavari deltas in Andhra Pradesh. So these deltas are another amazing ecosystems that have actually give us protection, and was very clearly seen in the last cyclone that hit Bengal in the cyclone Amphan. That mangroves protected a lot of communities in this area over here. And so all these ecosystems and have to be preserved because they have a certain role in playing in the whole protecting us and also eventually the whole larger landscape and the water security. So this is how the planning is actually, let me get into a little bit more planning now, where we talk about when we look at understanding of these landscape at a global scale, then at a local scale, and then when you start looking at planning and other landscape, regional planning and urban planning in these areas, you are looking at all these geographies. So you have to understand the region, the soil, the climate, the topography, where the water flows, the direction of the water flow, the biodiversity corridors, and then the human geography like the socioeconomic demography, land records, transportation, land use, land cover. We should not be focusing only on one aspect that, okay, Western Ghats is the most important for biodiversity, so let's ignore everybody else, and that you can't do because Western Ghats actually has 44 million people living in that. It's not just a forested area where nobody lives. It's 44 million people live there, and their livelihood depends on the Western Ghats. So you have to think about them also, and the connectivity and how people move around and transportation corridors, how do you plan them? So all these layers that I've mentioned in this here you have to analyze them, and then you have to see the impact of one on the other. What does the road cutting through Western Ghats, how does it affect the biodiversity, water resources, slopes, geology, soils, vegetation, what it does to the climate? All these things you have to look at it. And from our experience in the 2004 and 2008 tsunami and 2008 Northern India floods in Bihar also showed us that a lot of these things happen because we look at all these layers in isolation. We don't interact with these layers in terms of when you are planning. And there's a whole new emerging field, and that's a whole new topic of discussion I can do some other time, which is a new emerging field called geodesign, where you're using geospatial technologies like GIS into planning, and not just planning, but also in design. And that's a very, very new field, and it's just evolving. And you also are talking about people who are involved in more larger community-based mapping and planning. And you have to also incorporate the indigenous knowledge of the people, because people who've lived in these landscapes for generations, they have an amazing knowledge of how that landscape is because of the relationship to the geography. And that's one of the very powerful information and data that can corroborate and complement the satellite imagery and other data that you can collect from different fields. And the local communities, being an active participant, also becomes a larger stakeholder in this whole planning process. So that actually, all these things put together creates a nice framework for planning at a larger scale, and whether it's for conservation or whether it's for industrial area or whether it's for urban design or and all these layers. So the layers will change based on where you are, where the local geographies are, and that's how it works. So here is, I will just zoom into a little bit more in the Western Ghats, the Coorg part of it. So that's the district of Coorg, which is, just to give you an idea, it's slightly bigger than the size of Goa, about 400 square kilometers. Sorry, it's a little more than that. and it supports amazing species, like megafauna like the tigers, elephants, bison, the Nilgiri tahr, which is only found in this area, and of course the celebrated lion-tailed macaque, which is only found in the Western Ghats and nowhere else in the world, and that makes it an endemic species to that area. So Madhav Gadgil and his colleagues, when they were part of the Indian Institute of Science at the Center for Ecological Sciences, did extensive work in the Western Ghats, and they decided that it's not just we need to protect these in national parks and protected areas, but there should be connected and contiguous areas. So they work with several states. This is actually where 3 states meet, which is Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and Karnataka, and they actually together worked and created something called the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve, and that goes all the way to Bangalore, and that's the Bangalore city, and you can see the species can move freely along this, and they did an amazing job in that, and that's a very, very work that should be actually really applauded, what work they did in terms of saving the species and Western Ghats and conservation. But in the process, what happened, the land cover change continued to reduce, and the habitat of these protected areas are protected, but the habitat which is beyond these areas, because species go beyond protected areas, that habitat was shrinking constantly as we were converting lands for agriculture and industrial areas and cutting power lines and roads and railway lines. All those things are actually splitting landscapes across, and that's the species number of species went up. They got good protection, but their habitat was shrinking, and now we have cases of human wildlife conflict, and then we have with the human and species, we have the problems of viruses jumping across species and coming into human domain, and that has its own issues, and that we need to deal with. So to look at Coorg, this was what the landscape forest cover looked like in 1977, and these are the rainforests, and as you get these are the rainforests, and as you get inside, it gets a dry deciduous forest, and it gets more drier as you move further east. But look at the landscape, what happened by the time it was 1997, in 20 years, this large area has been cleared up, few areas have been left out because of the steep slopes, and this was largely cleared for coffee plantation. Coorg, being a small place, still produces 40% of India's coffee, and India is the 11th largest coffee producer in the world. And this is a amazing landscape, which is in the middle of a biodiversity hotspot, but cleared for coffee. And that's an economic activity that is it's a perfect climate for growing coffee here, and also in the northeastern part of India. And so this is what it shows: the forest cover, loss of forest cover between 20 years period. And you can see it went down almost from 63% to 45%, and areas under coffee doubled during this period. And an extensive study done by the French Institute in Pondicherry. And but the amazing part about these coffee states is that these are not really coffee states just for coffee. They actually are shade-grown coffee. So these are coffee plants planted in the middle of a forest. So they clear a little bit of the forest, and then they put this coffee, and then so it's actually a and so the elephants and species that move in, they don't know whether they're moving in from a forested area into a coffee estate, because it's a very multi-species coffee kind of thing, which also they grow trees in between, which grows this black pepper, and then there is cardamom, and there's a ginger growing, and all these spices are growing all within the same coffee estate, and that actually is a shade-grown coffee. And Costa Rica actually gets more price for their coffee because they are green coffee, unlike in countries like Brazil, where when they grow coffee, they literally clear-cut all the forest and then they start growing coffee. So this is actually a very sustainable way of growing coffee, and I believe we should be rewarding them by paying them a better price, because they're also supporting not just biodiversity but megafauna like elephants, tigers, leopards, bison, and deer. And so how does this whole thing come up when you start planning in these areas? You look at the topography. Here's the steep slopes, as I mentioned earlier. These are the Western Ghats, the steep slopes of Western Ghats. And as you move inside, it gets flatter areas, absolutely flat areas where there's you see along these riverlets, there is the small riverlets. You actually have rice growing along this flat areas. Slightly steep slopes, it becomes coffee interspersed with other spices. And then very steep areas, nothing grows, but also elephants don't like that because it's too steep a slope for them. And this is how you interpret the topography data and use that in, and then you use multiple other layers, and then eventually come up with a land use, land cover map. that shows what is actually happening over there. And these green areas that you see, and these areas are, this is Nagarhole National Park, right adjacent to that in Karnataka. This is in Karnataka, and right next to that in Tamil Nadu is the Mudumalai National Park. In Kerala, it's a Wayanad National Park. So this is the whole part of the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve. And I remember talking to one of the coffee estate owners there that, you have a beautiful necklace of protected areas around us, around your coffee, and you're growing middle of a nice, beautiful area. And he said that actually it's more like not a necklace, but it's more like a noose, because they have these elephants and other species coming in from there and cutting across through their through the coffee estates, and in the process, people die, and there are stampedes, and then there are damages to their houses and coffee areas. And human-wildlife conflict is a very, very serious issue in the country right now, and that has evolved because we've tried to keep. We are hoping that the species stay inside the protected area, and that's not what they also have evolved over the years. And it's largely also got to do with the population densities that you see around. The population density you see, the Western Ghats, very less population. And as you move away from Western Ghats, because of the steep slopes and forested areas, there are very few people live there, but still it's about 44 million people. And then as you go outside, you zoom out a little bit, this is the West Coorg area, and that you see the dense, very, very dense coastal Kerala, and that's the city of Mysore, and then this whole plains of Deccan Plateau of Karnataka and Maharashtra, where there's a huge agriculture and a population lives there. And this is what, we have to understand, that 44 million people, as I mentioned, live in the Western Ghats. About 5 million people live inside of protected areas. I'm not even talking about forested areas. These are protected areas, national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, bird sanctuaries. And there are 147 million people. Over 10% of India's population depends on the forest for their livelihoods, whether it's grazing or whether it's non-timber forest products. And so it's not like the US forests where nobody lives. The population densities are much lower, but here humans have always had a good relationship with their forest, and it's the tribal culture and all those things. They had a very good relationship with the forest. And also, culturally and spiritually, we are very linked to the species. The elephant is always linked to Lord Ganesha. The tiger is linked to Durga, and the snakes with Shiva. So the nature is very ingrained into a culture and spiritually, and also that's why you won't find that many cases of poaching in India of elephants as you find them in Africa, which is way high, because of that connection. The connection with nature is not there, and this is where the planning when you plan, you have to keep all these aspects in mind. So when you're looking at cultural or planning in Coorg, you actually look at what is happening with the urban areas, what is happening. They want to develop that as a tourist place. And that tourist place is really, really marketed as Scotland of India. There are 7 times more than the local population visits over there. There's largely human-elephant conflict problems. Infrastructure, new lines are being proposed. And then, of course, there are coffee markets in the tribal and the labor issues. So when you are planning in this at a district level or even at a larger scale level, you have to keep all these issues in mind. And the future of conservation will actually depend on how we are able to coexist with nature. And this is a map study done by Madhusudan from Nature Conservation Nature Conservation Society, and they have actually documented where they have seen elephants beyond protected areas. So this is a map of Karnataka. These dark boundaries you see are the national parks and protected areas, and this beige colored area that you see is all these areas where elephants have been spotted. So you can see how far they have moved. They move around in their areas beyond protected areas, and this is where whether we can coexist, whether we can't coexist, whether we need to put barriers. That's the whole debate that conservation community is going through, and they have different ideas about coexistence. And that's again a very, very strong debate that conservation community at some point needs to come to consensus and then help planners to come up with these solutions, or how do we plan our infrastructure, because people also live in these areas, and how do we plan these areas. So here, this is where a GIS helps us a lot. And Geographic Information System, as I mentioned, earlier Ian McHarg used to do his maps manually. He used to draw all these layers like the geology, hydrology, soils, topography. They used to manually draw these maps on a transparent sheet of paper, overlay them on each other, put them on a light table, and then put your development on top of it and see how it cuts across through different layers. So GIS, what it does, it deconstructs the landscape. You see there are a lot of things happening underneath. There's geology, water tables, superficial geology, there's soils, and there are a lot of things happening on top. And these are all mapped in different layers. And when they interact with, when you overlay them, you actually get a lot of information analysis, and you can actually do a lot of prediction modeling. And that GIS has become a very, very advanced field now, and you can actually, in many ways, create scenarios. And if you do this, business as usual, if you change one factor, how will the new factor look like? So it's a very, very advanced field now, and a lot of things can be done. So this is what GIS looks like. You have multiple layers, and you can look at and the number of layers and what layers are there will change based on which area you are mapping and which areas you're planning for. Some places there may be no biodiversity, so there's absolutely no layers for that, but there may be topography, hydrology. These layers are pretty much constant, and then human geography layers like transportation corridors, industrial areas. These are quite common areas, mapped layers that you use. So here is an example of how Ian McHarg used his, and this is what he did manually, because remember, he was from the pre-GIS era. GIS actually started picking up only in the mid-90s, and it's relatively a very new field. So this is what is an example of Staten Island in New York. So Staten Island is just little south of Manhattan, which is the main New York City, and so this is an island just south of that. That's New Jersey, and that's the Atlantic Ocean for you. So he had done these detailed studies, and these are documented in 1969. Can you hear me? Everything is okay? Hello?
Yes, sir, everything is fine.
Yeah, okay, sorry. So these are the different maps. As I said, he manually mapped all these layers. These are hand-drawn maps, by the way. So he had the different layers of geology, hydrology, soils, vegetation. These are all these thumbnail maps that you see, and then they were weighted along that which one you give more weightage, which one you give less weightage, and these graphs that you see over here. And then you have, again, you narrow them down, which are the most important layers that you need to take into effect, into consideration. And what is the question you're asking for? What are you doing the suitability analysis for? In this case, the analysis for where should the urban areas be developed. And this is the final map that he came up with, that you see on the lower left corner. He identified these dark areas, which you see over here, that he mentioned are unsuitable for urbanization. And then he identified the areas that should be urbanized, and accordingly he mentioned these areas. And look at what happened. This is in 1969, and look at what happened in 2012, almost 45 years later, when the Hurricane Sandy hit New York. These are the areas that were the most damaged, and those are exactly matched the areas those areas that he had identified in 1969. And this is how actually it helps you in terms of how you predict these areas, where you should build and where you should not build. I think these are some of the critical areas. So you are mapping the vulnerability from the coastal area, from vulnerability from sea level rise, from cyclones, from storm surges, from flooding. And then as you go inland, it could be landslide, it could be flooding, it could be something else. And I'll show you some more examples. And this is how you can actually plan these areas. And this is what he could do manually. I'm pretty sure we can do even better job with this, with the even more precise, down to the land parcel level when it comes down to detailed more analysis with GIS. So this is one of the other studies we did for the World Bank, and this was for looking at the major watersheds and what it does to the the transportation infrastructure. So you know that hurricane, there are cyclones that hit Orissa all the time, including the super cyclone of late 90s, and then the more recent ones. And the best thing that they can do right now, because people have been living there for years, is we have better weather forecasting, and we can now predict even the path of the cyclone. So you can actually do targeted evacuation, and you can only do targeted evacuation if your roads and bridges are in good condition. So this study was to see how the transportation corridors can be strengthened, and which ones are the weaker ones and which ones are more vulnerable ones in this watershed, which is largely affected. So this is Mahanadi watersheds and the adjoining rivers. That's the Mahanadi River, and then this Son, and then this is other river basins. And so what we did was we looked at these river basins and where do they flow out, and this is the Mahanadi River basin. and then these are the areas. This is Chilka Lake over here, and then these are roads and bridges that are there, or existing ones, and then these are the towns and villages where people live, and then these are the minor road networks. So we looked at the rainfall, the water flows coming down from the rivers, and then the topography, and then the series of cyclones and how far the water came in, the storm surges came in, and we analyzed data from the last 20 years, and then we came up with these areas which would be most affected, and that you see the flooding depth in coastal area, which areas would be, these dots are the bridges, the Orissa bridges, and that these are the bridges that need to be strengthened so that if there's a cyclone, and the cyclone also accompanies with heavy rainfall and the flood. It's not like tsunami that it was a bright, broad daylight and sunny day and then the tsunami just showed up. But in cyclone, we know that it accompanies with heavy winds, it comes with a lot of rain and can lead to flooding. So you are actually hit by multiple disasters, natural calamities. And so these are the areas that we identified as would be the most, we need to strengthen the road infrastructure and for evacuation of people from there. And the more people we evacuate, the more lives we save. And that's how largely we work with the weather department and the disaster management department of the state, and then that's how we plan the evacuations. You don't need to evacuate everybody. You can identify targeted vulnerable areas, and you can with the cyclone path and everything, and that's how we actually save resources and put the resources to the best use, because we all know that resources are limited and there's no point evacuating everybody, and that's how GIS helps us in a lot of these things. Here's another example of Kosi River, which is a river that's the India-Nepal border. This is the state of Bihar. This is a Kosi River that flows straight north to south, and that's the river Ganga flowing from east to west. That's the Bhagalpur, and Patna is more further west here. The Ganga flows east to west, and then, west to east, and then these rivers come and meet them, and this is what forms the larger Ganga watershed. So this is how the rivers are, and it's a matter of topography, slope, how much water comes down. So here there are steep slopes in the Himalayas, and I'll show you the next slide, we'll talk about it. We have steep slopes, the water comes down rushing along these slopes, and then it hits the plain, which is really, really flat, which is Bihar. This plain is really, really flat, this whole area. So what happens when a lot of water is coming down and it hits the plain, the water spreads, and that's when you get these multiple braided channels of the water. And so it becomes like an inland delta. It's almost like a delta like you see in Sundarbans or in Kaveri Delta, but this is actually inland. This is way away from the sea. And that's what happens in the flat. When you a lot of water in the flat area, it tends to spread, and it moves at a very slow speed, and that's why you have floodings in Bihar. And then you have roads that are cutting east-west, and these roads actually act like bunds because these roads are raised and they are high-level roads, and that's how it goes. So basically, this is how we go, and you look at these rivers, and then you try to, over the years, the river has changed its course, and then you can see there's a bund that is built, try to control the river. And what happens when you try to too much control the river, eventually it breaks the bund, and then you have areas get flooded which were never getting flooded before. And this is how human intervention can actually make you more vulnerable in the long run, but give you a sense of safety in the short run. And that's how we actually plan. And this problem doesn't start with just, so this is the border of Nepal over here. This is all Nepal, and that actually gets into China. So you see the watershed of Kosi River, actually it's almost 1/3 of Nepal. And it comes down from all this watershed from here, and it comes down into India at this narrow point here, and then it's again spreads out. So that's a bottleneck, and that's where the dam was built, and that's the one that gave way in the 2008 floods. And what happens in these areas, as long as these are very, very thickly forested green areas, everything is fine. But that's not always the case. You have a lot of deforestation happening in these areas. So you see these landscapes, these slopes are very, very denuded of any vegetation. And what happens when you take away a lot of vegetation, higher areas you see still vegetation is intact, but in these areas, if you take out the vegetation, there's less absorption of groundwater, recharge of the groundwater, and more increased runoff. And not just increased runoff, but it also carries a lot of silt, a lot of soil that triggers because of the erosion, and that carries that silt load in the river is increased, and that puts more pressure on these dams that are downstream. And this is why international collaboration at this level, interest in saving these watersheds are more important in Nepal than actually it affects us in India, and that's what the area looks like. Similarly, in South Africa, the watersheds are very, very important because they are very interested in saving the forests of Swaziland and Lesotho because that's where the South African rivers originate from. And that's why, these international collaborations are very important because water doesn't know borders, and that's how it goes. I'm giving some examples. Sorry, I'm taking a little longer, but let me just go through some of the slides very quickly. So this is a watershed and in Auroville, that's the circle of Auroville, that's Bay of Bengal, that's town of Pondicherry is just south of us. These orange lines you see are micro watersheds. Now we are getting into really, really micro watersheds. And that's how people live, and these are the roads crisscrossing these watersheds. So I'm going to show a little bit detail of this particular watershed, and these are these irrigation tanks that are linked to each other, and one tank flows into the next one, and these are the amazing water channel and tanks built during the Cholas period in almost 300 years ago that actually ensured the water security of these areas. And now we are actually trying to revive all these tanks because we don't get rainfall all through the year, so we have to preserve this water. And that's a big water body over here in the north called Kaluveli. So these watersheds, I'll just show you an example of this particular watershed. You see the small one here, which is this part of this lake. That's what it looks like. This is that lake, and this is the watershed. And now this watershed has been divided into 4 or 5 different areas. And when you don't provide culverts, don't allow the water to flow through it, this is what it leads to. It leads to flooding in the villages. And it happens in urban areas, it happens in villages, it happens everywhere. And this is how we have to look at the landscape and how we plan these and watersheds and roads and how we plan them. Another example of Nagapattinam district, which was affected by tsunami, we looked at the detailed elevation. This blue areas are actually below sea level, and red areas are areas that are between 0 and 3 meters and between 0 and 5 meters above sea level. You can see how far it goes in, and these are the sand dunes that are in front of them, and these sand dunes actually protect a lot of these people. So sand dune protection is really, really important to not just protect the backwaters, but also protect the backwaters from being saline, because these backwaters are fresh waters. And you don't want the salt water coming in, and that will affect the population who depend on this fresh water and the growing paddy over there. So this is the Nagapattinam town. You can see that traditionally all the towns were in the high elevation areas. And then this is all in the middle of Kaveri Delta. And so land analysis and topography is really, really important, and how you relocate. You want to move people away from the coast because you want them to be safer from cyclones, and you want to be safer from tsunami. But you move them in, and you might be making them vulnerable to flooding. So you have to think in multiple ways of multiple disasters. Here is an example of very more detail of Kaveri Delta. That's the largest, almost the northern end of Kaveri Delta. This is the largest channel of Kaveri. And these are these beautiful Pichavaram mangroves. And there was a village which was over here, which was completely devastated. MGR said to completely devastated in tsunami. They agreed to relocate over here, but then it got flooded in the next monsoon. And that's what, just to look at it closely, this was the village. It got relocated over here, and it got flooded, and we were called to see why it got flooded. And we found out that they built this new road, access road, with nothing no water providing to pass through, no bridges. And this was the low-lying area. That was the line where tsunami came in, how far the water came in. And once they opened up these roads, the bridges underneath, they were totally fine. So when you are planning these infrastructure roads and giving access to people and trying to connect neighborhoods, you have to look at where the water flows are and how we are looking at. And it's more difficult in flat areas like delta areas because the land is so flat. So you have to have some really high resolution surveys and satellite imageries to get that. So I'll just come to an end with talk a little bit about Bombay. Everybody knows the 2005 floods of Bombay. And I generally like to talk about this example because Bombay is actually, I call it a gifted city. It has these urban areas. Now this is a bridge over here across this Worli Sea Face. I think, sorry, that's not Worli Sea Face. Worli, that bridge is over here. That bridge is over here. That's the Sea Link Bridge, and then this is that's the airport over here. You see the runway. That's the Western Express Highway, then the Eastern Express Highway, and that's the Thane Creek. So this is the Powai Lake over here, and that's Vihar, and then Vaitarana, and there's a series of lakes. So middle of Bombay, this is the high elevation area. That's where IIT Powai is, and the Sanjay Gandhi National Park or the Borivali National Park. And then there are some mangroves along the coastal areas, and that's the dense area of Bombay. You see that pink color is all urban built up areas. Then there are some areas along Chembur and other areas which has mangroves. These are the Victoria area mangroves. Godrej owns a lot of land in this area. a mix of a lot of different landscapes. So this is gifted because, I call it gifted because you have this high elevation mountain in the middle of the city and these freshwater lakes, which actually are the water security. So it's like having a big overhead water tank that supplies water to the rest of the city. And in early days, this was very well protected. A very low impact land use was allowed here, like the institutional, like IIT Bombay and other institutional areas were provided here. But some point in late 80s, early 90s, they opened up for a very density development, like the Hiranandani estates and all on the western side. So over the years, that watershed got destroyed, and today I don't believe the Powai Lake water is anymore can be supplied unless you purify it, and then they have moved to other lakes, and then there are series of more lakes. So, but as this area is more protected, likelihood that this will stay. But what happens when you have a mountain in the middle? You have actually channels because the water is flowing down in both ways. These channels that you see were actually should have been connected, and you should have had these green corridors which were connecting all the way up here. So here's the example of what, when you zoom in really close, when you zoom into this area. So that's the overflow channel called the Mithi River. Mithi means actually sweet, and maybe the water was sweet at some point, but today is nowhere close to sweet. And I think people from Bombay would tell you that it's no longer sweet water. There are a lot of industrial areas around there, along it, and that, there's a lot of pollution that has gone into it. And so they had this river, and then there was this. This is the airport. These are the runways. That's the Western Express Highway, and then this is this Mithi River. When it gets closer to the sea, this is the Mahim Creek, and then between the airport and this area, I remember I used to live in, I used to visit this Bombay JJ College of Architecture hostel, and between the hostel on the west, on the Bandra East and the airport, there was a huge swath of backwaters, grassland, wetland area, which is now all built up, and it's all Bandra Kurla complex and other areas have come up. So that has reduced the water holding capacity of this area. And then when the water is coming down at a very heavy rain is happening, there's a high tide at the same time, and the water has nowhere to go. It has to go somewhere, and that's where it ends up going into all these areas. It floods into the runway, it floods into the areas, and if you look at the map, you will see it actually floods only in these areas. And then, of course, there are other areas which the water should be going down, and these areas, you see that this is a mangroves over here, but this particular mangrove had disappeared over here now. And this is because that's where the Orbit Mall is and other, so we have actually, over the years, have changed our landscape, and ideally, this is what your landscape, I mean, I'm just coming back to Auroville as an example, that this is what the Auroville landscapes were. The canyons were eroded, they were taking a lot of red soil into the sea. The coastal area around the sea, around Auroville in the early 70s was actually red, and over the years, you can do restoration of landscape and come down. You can see the water quality, it's like pure clear water that's flowing through. And this is how we should have green corridors inside the city, and these can be used as passive landscape areas for cycling, for jogging tracks, and and other landscape areas. And this is how you can actually integrate these landscapes into urban areas. And I believe this is how we actually, when you look at all these landscapes, you know which ones to preserve and which ones to build, and then actually the landscape tells you what you can do in these areas. And I think this is where I would like to stop with this one last slide, where just to mention the last point is that over the years we have actually extracted a lot of natural resources. We have cut down a lot of forests. We have built in areas which were natural water bodies, watersheds. Basically, we have we have extracted a lot of resources from the nature. But what you are seeing today in the last 10 years, 15 years, the signs are very clear. The flooding that you see in urban areas, every city gets flooded in nowadays, and it's becoming a regular phenomenon every year. Rural areas also get flooded, although they don't come in the news as much. And then human-wildlife conflict is increasing. Then you have the contact with wildlife, and then there's viruses coming up like Ebola and other viruses. And the most recent, of course, I don't need to mention the coronavirus, as we get closer to species. This is actually, according to me, nature's way of telling us that we have to change our way we have planned, and we have done our planning so far. If we don't do, we will continue. And this is the nature's way of saying that, okay, you've been extracting our resources, my resources, for a long time. but now it's my time and I'm going to reclaim my habitat. And this is how elephants come out and they say, this is okay, we used to live there, you started living here, but now we are taking away, reclaiming my habitat. And this is where the ducklings came back into cities, and they were very happy in the flooded areas. Probably they were the only happy species in that area. And this is where we actually need to seriously look at our world in a different angle. And we as designers, it's our responsibility that we need to, because we are the ones responsible for most built spaces and alteration in the landscapes on the planet. And so it's our responsibility that we do this with a full understanding and responsibility of understanding these landscapes and how we build them. And that's where I would like to stop. Sorry, I've taken more time than I thought I would. So if you have any questions.
Yes, thank you so much for this insightful presentation, sir. It was indeed a lot for us to grasp, but I'm sure we have learned a lot and we have a lot of questions to ask you. So
Okay.
I will just quickly begin with the questions that have piled up. I think the first question, yes, so this is from Priyanka, and this is, sir, in reference to when you were talking about the river Kaveri and you were talking about Kurg. So you mentioned about the completely altered landscape. So she's asking that what is your observation about the rivers in India? There are many studies which say that rivers are dying. So is it really possible to take already altered landscape and then work around it?
Okay, that's a very good question, and I'm glad somebody asked it because so some landscapes examples I showed you early on, like the Aral Sea, that's a gone landscape. You can't really bring it back unless you are seriously restoring the water, the rivers that used to come back in. And remember that landscapes that we have altered will never come back to what they would be, what they were, in the past. I don't think we can ever come back to that landscape. So we have to come up with, because people are living in these areas and people are living them. We have, you can't really, even if people are living there for 30 years, you can't really tell them, no, you can't live there anymore because this is a really important landscape. But you have to work with the landscape. And that's where, in some cases, it's mitigation measures. And in some cases, it would be, okay, you have to work with the people to actually understand that, okay, it may not be, it's possible to change the river courses, but we may have to ask some people to relocate, not too far, not away from their livelihoods, but maybe just to a safer ground, and some areas are changed, gone back, or some areas that open up over time that, somebody's selling a land, like a lot of coffee estates in between when the coffee estates were actually down and when Brazilian coffee was at its peak. And this was about 10-15 years ago when Indian coffee was not doing very well. A lot of people were moving away from coffee and they wanted to sell the land. And that's when the government can move in and say, okay, you're selling the coffee estate area and it's not a very profitable business. So let's take this and give it back to nature. So this is how you can actually start working bit by bit. But I think in some cases we've gone too far. I hope it answers the question, but I can elaborate more, but that's a very, very long discussion.
Thank you so much, sir. Priyanka, if you have any supplementary question, you can again write to us and then I'll ask on your behalf. But meanwhile, sir, moving on to the next question. This is when you were talking about the cyclones in Odisha. The question is, how can architecture help shape these communities to survive these frequent cyclones?
Another very good question. I get this question a lot. And so I think landscape architects, planners, and urban designers and architects have to go beyond looking at doing houses and areas for gated communities. Basically, we serve a very small section of a rich society. And but there are a lot of other things that needs planning. I mean, you must be wondering what does a landscape architect do with World Health Organization, for example. I was working in Ethiopia where we were looking at outbreak of cholera in 2017, and cholera we know spreads from water, contaminated water. And so we were actually looking at communities and what is their water source and where they're coming from. We can continue treating patients who are coming from contaminated, who are coming because of the contaminated water source, but the idea, the plan should be to fix that water source so that we don't get cholera. We can keep treating the patients, but if they keep coming because they continue to drink water, I think that needs to be fixed, that source. And that's why we have to, this is again a planning issue. Similarly, people who live in refugee camps, that actually needs the planning. If you go and look at the way refugee camps are designed, they're put together by engineers or somebody who has no clue about planning. There are people, there are some of the largest refugee camps that I've seen has like 500,000 people living there, 500,000 people living there, or 200,000 people living there, and they are in pathetic condition. That actually needs planners and designers to come there and do something. So people should be working with UN High Commission for Refugees or UNICEF and other organizations, MSF, Medicine Sans Frontiers, or Engineers Without Borders and Doctors Without Borders. There are so many of area people who are trying to do struggle. World Vision. There is, you name it. If you go into any disaster area, there's so many of NGOs come up, and they actually have not that many architects actually working from them. They're actually struggling to get architects to work with them, and that's something that we saw during tsunami. After tsunami, we worked for almost 4 years, and then the rehabilitation actually went on for almost 10 years beyond after tsunami, because rehabilitation doesn't happen. So there is a immediate relief phase, and then there's a long-term phase. But basically, this is where we have to look beyond our comfort zone of working in an office that works for rich clients and corporates, or I don't know. Actually, I've been out of touch with this field for a while, so maybe people are doing this work, but I think we have to go beyond our areas and engage with the government. Remember that largely the planning and large land areas that are planned are actually done by the government, town and country planning organizations, and there is a very little capacity that is there, and you have to come in there and push the government to do that. We engage all the time with IAS officers, with bureaucrats, with politicians, with NGOs, and trying to build a bridge between them. We have to support the NGOs that are working on the ground with technical knowledge, with these mappings and solutions, so that they can do their work better. If environmentalists come and say no to everything, it's very easy for the authorities or government to brand them as anti-development, and because they are saying no, but they are not able to provide solutions. So these are the people who we need to support with all this technical knowledge, so that, okay, you're saying no, but maybe this other place is a better place to go and do the development. And this is what we try to do, is work with groups where we try to tell them, okay, you are very much there on the ground, and we will help you with the technical knowledge. And you work with the communities. There's this famous group in Bhuj, Hunarshala, which does a lot of work with communities around India, and also they are almost there after every disaster. They really helped us with the community planning and interacting with the communities, and how to help interact with the government in framing their policies, because largely this disasters and post-disaster, this is largely a lot of policy work goes into it, and the policies have to be supported with proper science and knowledge, and that's how you can actually work with this. So actually, we have to interact with people beyond our clients and go into NGOs, government, bureaucrats, politicians, and other multilateral agencies like UN and the World Bank. So I hope it answers the question.
So, sir, I would like to ask you a supplementary question on this comment of yours. I mean, when you're talking about engaging with bureaucrats, when you're talking about engaging with the government, I mean, when we look at the scale as large as this one, we're talking about mangroves in Mumbai, for instance. There is a lot of politics associated with such places, such landscapes. So we as urban designers, we as landscape architects, planners, what do you think, where do we fit in? What is our role? And when you especially spoke about how, there is a conflict, sometimes we have to make somebody understand that, okay, you should not be developing here, but maybe somewhere else. How do you think that conflict should be handled? And if you want to also mention other challenges that one faces while dealing with such, such landscape, such scale of landscape.
Okay, so you're right. So basically, why does every square inch of the land gets built in the city area? Like lakes of Bangalore are disappearing. You can read, and there's enough literature on the lakes of Bangalore. There is mangroves in Bombay area, and I think they are largely intact only because large part of that is owned by Godrej, and they have decided that they would actually keep them as they are. And but it's just, I mean, this Goregaon, RA Milk area, it's a lung of the city that has to be preserved. And then there are areas which, so basically, why these small, every square inch of the land gets built? Because it's largely driven by the real estate lobby in the city. And they want to build on every square inch of land, and then whether it's vulnerable, not vulnerable, people buy the land, buy the house, buy the property, eventually build there, and eventually 2 years down the line, after they start living there, it gets flooded because they have altered the topography, they have altered the water channels over there, and by the time the builder has sold the land and the property and he's moved on. So there is, of course, we have to admit that there's always a very strong lobby between the real estate, a very strong partnership between real estate lobbies and the politicians. Of course, there's larger issues like election funding, and a whole lot of things are there. But remember one thing, that people, the community has the vote in the end. So largely, if you have the community on your side, I don't think anybody can do anything. And so it's a very, very large question. If you start doing something today, maybe you'll see the result after 10 years. We don't live in a world where the planners don't live in a world where you do something today and it gets done tomorrow. It's not like an interior design project which gets implemented in 3 months, 4 months, 6 months. Because this is something that you have to constantly engage, and the government really doesn't want you to engage because they want the business as usual to continue going on, and it's in your interest that you have to be persistent. You have to constantly be in their face and say that, till they think that, okay, this guy is not going to go away, let's have a word with him, let's have a dialogue with him. And I think it comes back to constant engagement, and the more community you have with you, the more stronger you get. And I think that's a model that we learned from Hunarshala, that if the community is with you, nobody can do anything pretty much, because the politicians will move only if they feel that they might lose a vote. And so it's a large scale engagement, organizing yourself into whatever way you want, whether it's rallies or whether it's petitions or whether it is but I think the role of architects is to support these people who are actually doing this work on the ground, which is petitions or the protesting or I mean, RA Milk Colony showed a lot that there was a highway proposed to Auroville 2 years ago, and we had to go all the way up to the PMO office, and we had to engage with the Ministry of Highways and Transport. We had to engage with Tamil Nadu state government, district collector, village panchayat, all the way up to, we did go, I'm seriously saying that I have to go all the way to PMO level to get this highway. And then it didn't stop just because we went all the way there. We actually came up with better solutions. And in the end, it was convinced. It took us 1.5 years, almost 2 years, till finally the transportation minister came here and announced that, okay, we agree with you that this is a better solution than what you have provided us, and we will actually do the highway on that side. And so I think it was a long engagement. It went on for a long time. We had to run around Delhi from pillar to post. We had several meetings. We went to Delhi. It got cancelled. Came back again. Went. So it's a constant engagement. And then there were people working with the villagers on the ground, and then they were working with the environmental people. We looking at the water security. We had a very solid technical report that we presented to the government that if you do this highway over there, it's not just affecting Auroville, because we are not saying just because we don't want it in our backyard, but it was a bad idea where they were putting that highway. And I think in the end it was convincing for not just the NHAI, which is the National Highway Authority of India, but also with the local people, and the government eventually got convinced. And so it was a long struggle, but it can be done, and it really tests your perseverance.
So, sir, so a similar question which talks about how most of the city of Mumbai is already built. So how do you think we can still, initiate green corridors and other such ideas in a city which most of the land is already been, built?
Yeah, so I think that Mahim Park Creek Park was an effort to try to bring back some of the landscape that was affected, and I think I believe that was, but I think it has to happen not just in a small stretch, but has to happen right from where the river originates, Viti River, and goes all the way down to the place where it meets the sea, and all along we have to see what can be done. I have friends who worked on the Bombay airport, and they said it's so low-lying area, and because we actually, if you want to make the Bombay airport safe from flooding, we have to raise the whole airport by a few feet actually, which is also not feasible. But people have tried doing bunds, and people do come up with engineering solutions. I think the first priority should be trying to see that whether wherever possible, we do something about bringing nature back in those areas. In some places, it's understandable, absolutely not possible. And in some areas, then you have to really go into details all along the stretch of the river to see literally parcel by parcel land, each land patta, to see whether what is happening there and what, it needs a very, very detailed study, and who owns that, and and then it has to be a serious engagement. And then it's not just that river, but there are other slopes that is actually feeding into that. And eventually, at a larger level, if there is any possibility of change in the policies, that okay, if there is any plot available along this river, it should be converted into green and not just given back to another industry. I think so there's some engagement needed with the needs of the Maharashtra government is needed, so that policy is in place. Okay, along this river, any plot that is available at any time should go back to green areas, and then that green area should be, and similarly, what you do with when a Hirandani estate is built, you can't remove that. But can you actually, over time, can you build some buffers around there? Can you, instead of the road, can there be something else happening there? I mean, it needs a very detailed study. Can there be something else happening there? Maybe Powai Lake has, again, no hope. It may not be as bad as RLC, but maybe still it cannot be used for drinking water, but that's still a big loss. Bombay is lucky. It has, as I mentioned, that it has other lakes that you can fall back on. Not every city or every place has. That's why I call it a gifted city. Not other places have that option. So yeah, so it has to be a detailed study. It has to be detailed analysis. And I think we can do that as part of our students can do that as part of their studios. And I have friends who are doing that in the School of Environment and Architecture in Bombay, where they're looking at in detail how students are engaged into detailed areas around. And I think if we take bit by bit, and then while we are doing this, we are actually interacting with the government officials. Interacting with government officials should become a part of curriculum, and to hear their views. We actually, when I did a studio at UC Davis on the landscape architecture, we invite them to talk to students and give their perspective as to why that policy was put in place in the first place. Why did that wetland area got converted into Bandra Kurla complex, for example? So they can give some historical background, historical perspective. Okay, we may not be able to bring that wetland back, but there are other wetlands that can be saved. And I think it's good to understand how these policies came in place. And eventually, we may not be able to save everything or bring back everything, but some areas can be saved and some areas can be brought back.
Right. So, sir, there is another question by Chaitanya. This is on the Narmada project. He's asking that major dam projects are also affecting the ecosystem along the river banks. What are your comments on the Narmada Valley and frequent flooding that takes place in the vicinity of Sardar Sarovar Dam? What should be our approach as planners to restore livelihood in these areas? Because somewhere water conservation projects are also hampering people who are dependent on the river and also the ecosystem along.
Yeah, actually, Narmada is a very, very complex area. Medha Patkar went there to study. She's an anthropologist, and she actually social scientist who went there to study the plight of the people who are affected by it. And that area, I don't think it ever got a very detailed environmental impact study of. Most people who went there were, I think, except one economist Paranse actually did a environmental impact, and not just environmental impact, but economic study of the cost of this dam. And the work that Medha Patkar and other people did over the years. Of course, World Bank was funding a lot of these projects over earlier years, and eventually they really went back on the policies at some point. One time withdrew their funding, and then there was they actually set up something called the World Commission on Dams. Actually, Medha Patkar was on that big commission, which actually went and looked around that anything that is man-made is actually has a life. So concrete has a life of 90 years, 80 years, 100 years, 120 years. But this concrete thing. Eventually, in the US, there are places where they're decommissioning these dams because it's just too risky to have them there, because it's a man-made thing. It has a life. It can't dam. Once it's built, doesn't mean it will last forever. So we have to think in those terms that okay, at some point we'll have to start decommissioning some of the dams, and it may not happen in our lifetime, but maybe in your lifetime, or maybe in your children's lifetime. And then what do we do with these areas? So there are areas in the northeast of the US where they are looking at what to do with these when these dams are decommissioned. How do you, because when the dams are built, people downstream, the less water goes downstream, and then people start living there, settlements come up, and they'll be living there for 30, 40, 50 years now. So how do we re-engineer those areas or re-plan those areas with the view that, okay, someday this dam is going to go away? And eventually we'll have to think of that. But to look at I think, look at what Narmada specific case was, that it was, they needed, and that time there was not that much of interest in environment when this project was first planned. It was planned in the time when people didn't know about geology, environment, mapping didn't exist, all those kind of things. And when we hadn't heard of climate change, sea level rise at that time. Sustainable development word itself is only from 1992. When the Earth Summit, Rio Summit happened, that's when the word of sustainable development came into being. So we are a little behind, and now we are trying to catch up with our destruction that we've done, and that is something that we'll have to struggle with for many years to come. So yes, so it was something that started as an Adivasi struggle now tells us a lot more things that the dams can do and what problems it can create. So a lot of knowledge is actually is coming up from what we learn as we go, and what knowledge we have today. 20 years down the line, we'll have more knowledge about it. So based on that, hopefully we'll do better planning in future. So does that answer the question of the dams?
Well, I hope it does, sir. I mean, at least I have big clarity.
I don't have all the answers. It's I can just tell you from whatever examples that we have gone through, whatever struggles that we have gone through, and it's a difficult path, but you have to get into it, and more people have to get into it. More people get into it, it gets easier.
Right. So, sir, I know that we're running out of time. We're already 25 minutes over our schedule, but yeah. I would just ask you one last question, which is not related directly with urban planning or design, but it's more about the consumerism. So one of my batchmates, Meet, he has asked a question, but he talked about the cotton plantation that you mentioned, and it talks about how that damages the landscape. You gave us the example of the lake in Kazakhstan. Yeah. And you also mentioned this excessive coffee plantation resulting into conflicts between non-human life forms and humans. So he's asking that what role do we as consumers play in shaping this landscape? As practitioners of urban design, also, in that sense, we have to extend our responsibility to that. And he's saying that, as I believe that it's obvious that someone is demanding these products or public relation industries, which works 24/7, aiming to convert humans into consumers, is creating a demand for these products, manipulating people, creating ill-informed consumers, making irrational choices. So what role do they also play in shaping these landscapes? And what roles we as consumers and these businesses have in inequalities that we see in the distribution of natural resources. With this, sir, I'll also combine another question by Purnima, where she's asking that, cotton has always been cultivated in India since 4,000 years. So how do we strike a balance with cotton cultivation and environment? And similarly, she talks about textile and Indian economy. So this is what the overall question is about. I've clubbed 2 questions. I'm sorry, both of you guys, we're running out of time. But what are your thoughts?
I'll answer the second question first. So yes, cotton is grown for a very, very long time in India, and it's, the whole cotton belt in the central India where Tata Cotton Mills. I come from that area, Nagpur, which is a very, very black cotton soil. The soil is known as a black cotton soil, and that you're right. So that's a cotton is something that has been grown quite a lot, and now I think as far as I remember, cotton is the only BT cotton is the only cotton that is the genetically modified GM cotton. Actually, that's what the word I was looking for. GM. That's only one one commodity in India that is genetically modified in India is the cotton, and that's why I call it BT cotton. We tried to bring in BT brinjal a few years ago, but Jairam Ramesh stopped it as an environment minister. And but anyway, coming back to so cotton. So that idea of cotton growing was because it's not something that we consume, so that's why it was permitted, and so that did increase the tenacity of the cotton plant and to be less attacked by pests and other things, and so use of pesticides has gone down. And this is a justification given by the cotton promoters of BT cotton. So so cotton is grown around. So we have actually, when we got independence, we were about 400 million people. Now we are over a little less than 1 billion more. So obviously, and look at our consuming patterns. Our parents used to consume much less, and so that comes to the second question. The first question, which is the consumerism is actually largely responsible for what we have done to our earth and landscape. And unfortunately, we living in a society where largely the economy depends on how much you spend, and more you spend, the economy survives. And we have seen examples of economic crash in 2008, and now with COVID virus, when everybody is indoors and trying to, the factories and everything is shut down. We see environment coming back. We see cleaner air in Delhi. We see less, because less vehicles on the road and less industries are open. So I think this has actually given a glimpse of what we could actually do and actually also gives us a second thought that do we really need all these things to run the planet? Of course, there are a lot of jobs that are dependent on them. There are a lot of people who would lose jobs if all these industries are shut down. But yes, plastic industry, if you shut down, it will have problems with a lot of people losing jobs. But while you're doing that, we should be actually planning for repurposing these people into something different, much more sustainable product, which can be actually not damaging. So we cannot stop producing dependence on plastic, for example, just because a lot of people will lose jobs. So we have to provide for that alternative jobs for them in different areas, and we have to be innovative about these and to tackle all these things so that we can actually not have to fight people who say that we can't stop plastic because we'll lose a lot of jobs. I mean, firecrackers, people lose jobs when you ban firecrackers. So people lose jobs if you start consuming less. But can we actually rethink the world? See that there is a largely also, I mean, I'm getting into much more larger picture now. Look at the world. It was designed, the institutions that are running the world today, the UN, the World Bank, were actually designed almost 70, 80 years ago. They were actually the institutions that were designed to reconstruct the world after the devastation of the World War II. And today we have moved on. Today we have different sets of problems that we have to deal with. So there are people who are thinking about that we need to re-engineer this whole world. And what we are attempting, what work that we do is a very small piece of that larger thing. That do we really need World Bank? Do we really need World Trade Organization? Do we really need the kind of I mean, there have been debates about even WHO is needed or not. But until we come up with something which can be actually there to deal with this, we cannot just disband these things. And these agencies have done a good job, and they have actually been they have served their purpose over the years. But yes, it is a time to re-engineer the world and to see whether consumerist capitalist economy is the right thing for the world, where actually consuming more is what keeps the economy running. And that is something that gets into a very large debate. And there are people who are thinking in terms of, okay, we need to redesign the whole world. And we need to redesign some point in maybe 50 years, 60 years ago, we decided that we need 4 years to do an undergraduate degree. Now, if you really think about it, do you really need 4 years to do an undergraduate degree? So we need to redesign our education system. So there are many things that we need to redesign in this world, and we need to not be stuck into it, and we need to think innovatively. I mean, look at one of these topmost people like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs and all. Did they actually succeed because they have degrees, or did they? No, they dropped off. Their school dropouts. No, and did they really had to go through these 4 years of degree to do what they wanted to do? Probably not. And as the world is changing, we need to redesign a lot of things. So planning is one aspect. Then there's education, there's consumerism, there's production, there's factories. There are these policy making institutions. Like we constantly say, I constantly talk about the silos in departments. See, we are taught, when we are looking at education, we are taught to look at engineering. We produce engineers, we produce sociologists, we produce planners, but at some point we have to think that why aren't they interacting with each other, even at education level? When we are now IITs are now having social sciences department, IITs now even have geography departments, but that was unthinkable 20, 30 years ago. Now, every field is becoming interdisciplinary now, but a lot of things have to change before they can actually be truly interdisciplinary. Now, I work with geologists, scientists, flood experts, hydrologists, scientists, others. We work with a lot of people. Now, when you have to, but a lot of structure has to change. So education system has to change. So it has to be more interdisciplinary. Then the next thing is that when you go and work out in the field, you can't be just looking at Department of Water Resources, Department of Highways, Department of Environment and Forest. They have to be interdisciplinary. They have to interact with each other. And GIS actually, we find in many ways, brings a lot of these breaks down these silos and brings a lot of these departments together. And that's why GIS, I find, is a very powerful tool, and it has given me the power to do whatever work I've done so far. Success or no success, I don't know, but it has given me much more insight into how we can make different departments work together. And again, we have to break down these barriers of budgets also, that we have budget for health sector, we have budget for water sector, we have budget for roads. Why aren't they interlinked with each other? If we do a good job in environment, maybe our health budget should be less because we have less sick people. If we clean our rivers, we'll have less cholera cases, and our health budget will automatically reduce. So we have to think interdisciplinary. But that I'm getting into a very, very larger areas, and that's a very, very long and big debate. But we do have debates at that level where we need to think in many ways that we need to redesign this world in many ways. I mean, look at Nandan Nilekani's books like Reimagining India, or there are people who are thinking in many ways, and technology helps in visualizing a lot of things. But at the same time, we have to it has to be equitable development. We can't leave anybody behind in this whole thing. We cannot be, like for example, just to give you a small example, and I'll stop after this. We have had a lot of online classes because of this corona pandemic, and a lot of people, you talk to them, they say, great, we had all these classes in studios and everything was online. But think of millions of kids who have no access to cell phones and no access to online internet divide. There's a digital divide in the country, which we should be aware of. And they had nothing access to all these things. And they are people, so we have a society which has people have and have nots. And that we have to think. So we cannot continue our development and our policies in a way that we leave a large section of the people behind. And I think that is what will be actually make us better as a society, only if we take everybody together with us. So I think I'll stop at that. I hope I didn't go way beyond. This is way beyond the topic of the presentation, but this is something that we constantly think of these things.
Yes, definitely, sir. Thank you so much for your presentation. And I think a lot of it's good to talk about these things, because you yourself, you spoke about how interdisciplinary these things are. I mean, urban design, urban planning, economy, all of these things. So it's really nice that it is the much needed talk today. And I think the students here have definitely gotten a lot of insight on landscape, on GIS, and how we can tackle, at least maybe not very in particular, but at least we know the kind of things that we need to keep in mind while we are dealing with such skills and such landscape. So I would like to again thank you so much, sir, for joining us. And I will see you all next week at the same time, 5:30, with a new speaker.
Vidisha, I'm putting my email address in case people have any questions. I'm just putting them in the chat. Putting my email address.
Definitely.
I couldn't answer all the questions. I see many. I mean, I didn't get a chance to go through all of them, all the chat messages, but there are very interesting questions. But in case they want to reach out, I'm just putting my email address over there. I've just put it in the chat. I just want to check whether it's correct. Yeah. So I put my email address in case people have. Feel free to write to me. I'll try my best to answer questions.
That'll be really nice, sir, because we had a lot of questions. So thank you so much, sir, and thank you everyone for joining us. I will see you again next week, 5:30 on Friday.
Yeah, and thank you for the opportunity. I really enjoyed talking to students, and I'm glad your questions were really good, and they were actually, they sounded very motivating. So there's always a hope, that we will have, because this is what you have to take care of these things. I don't think we are leaving a better world for you, but you have to really take on these things. And I think we are still learning from our mistakes, and I think you have to take this forward. So yeah, and happy to help out anytime, anywhere, wherever you need help. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.